This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
Hello, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. The strike on Syria on hold. Now, President Obama is hoping Russia will help save him from his own Congress. The president has asked lawmakers to delay a vote on Syria until it might be possible for the international community to take control of Assad's chemical capability. His argument, only the threat of military intervention is necessary to keep the process moving. ABC's Karen Travers in Washington has been following the story and has more on these latest developments. Karen?
Good afternoon, Ty. President Obama said last night that America's ideals and principles are at stake in Syria, but for now, he's willing to try and work with world leaders to come up with a solution that doesn't include a military strike. After a frantic 2 weeks of scrambling on Syria, today Washington paused. President Obama and members of Congress marked the anniversary of the September 11th attacks with moments of silence and solemn ceremonies. A U.S. military strike on Syria seems less likely now. Syria said yesterday it will turn over its chemical weapons, but there are big questions about how that would actually happen. In an address to the nation last night, President Obama welcomed these developments, but he showed a healthy dose of skepticism.
It's too early to tell whether this offer will succeed, and any agreement must verify that the Assad regime keeps its commitments.
Secretary of State John Kerry heads to Europe this week to meet with his Russian counterpart to try and work out a plan. The administration is also pushing for a Syria resolution through the UN Security Council. Diplomacy is the focus right now, but the president insisted last night a military strike must still be an option.
Our ideals and principles, as well as our national security, are at stake in Syria. With modest effort and risk, we can stop children from being gassed to death.
But nearly two-thirds of Americans oppose military action, and it's unclear if President Obama's speech last night changed any minds.
I think President Obama presented his case, but he did not convince me.
I think it's not the right thing to do at this point. I think if he'd done it 2 or 3 weeks ago without the equivocation, it would have been fine.
Congress is also on hold. No upcoming votes on any Syria resolutions as lawmakers wait and see if diplomacy works. Ty?
All right. Thank you, Karen Travers, joining us from Washington. And we're also joined via Skype from Moscow by ABC's Kirit Radia. Kirit, President Obama last night, in the clearest terms, laid out the prospect of a Russian-brokered deal. Let's listen.
Over the last few days, we've seen some encouraging signs, in part because of the credible threat of U.S. military action, as well as constructive talks that I had with President Putin. The Russian government has indicated a willingness to join with the international community in pushing Assad to give up his chemical weapons. The Assad regime has now admitted that it has these weapons, and even said they joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits their use. It's too early to tell whether this offer will succeed, and any agreement must verify that the Assad regime keeps its commitments. But this initiative has the potential to remove the threat of chemical weapons without the use of force, particularly because Russia is one of Assad's strongest allies.
Now, Kirit, the Putin government is never easy to read, but is there a sense that they are really committed to making that work?
I think they are, and mainly it's because they're afraid of an American strike on Syria for a number of reasons. Vladimir Putin himself has said that he thinks that an American or a Western strike in Syria would further destabilize the conflict, would aid al-Qaeda-backed elements inside Syria, would destabilize the entire region, but also because, remember, Russia has its own strategic interests at stake. President Assad is a longtime ally of the Russian government. His father was a longtime ally of the Soviet government, and there is a concern in Russia that they could be losing some leverage in the Middle East if that government falls. So certainly they do want to have the diplomacy succeed, if only to preserve those elements.
Now, we should mention that John Kerry mentioned a similar scenario during a press conference on Monday, but do you think that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov expected the Americans to latch onto this so quickly?
This was something that has been discussed between the U.S. and the Russians going back at least a year, if not a little bit more than that. So it's something that that both sides knew about and had been talking about. Perhaps they had been planning on doing something eventually. It does appear that Secretary Kerry at least jumped the gun a little bit by making it public on Monday, and the Russians saw that opportunity and definitely seized it. They saw a vote coming on Congress, one that President Obama may well have lost, in fact, but they saw the possibility of a strike, and it was something, as I said, that they were very worried about, and they seized the opportunity to make sure that there were alternatives, something that could avert a strike that they're opposed to.
You mentioned the Russian government keeping tabs on Congress. How much of this do you think is there pouncing on the fact that Obama was on shaky ground with Congress, potentially refusing to go along with his plan?
Well, I don't think they were looking to bail out the president the Russians were looking to bail out the president politically. I think that they saw that there was a possibility of a strike. It was something they saw as dangerous for the conflict in the region, and again, contrary to their own strategic interests, and that was their primary motivator, not American politics.
What does Russia have to gain by brokering the deal here? Obviously, no one expects the Assad regime to fully give up all of its chemical weapons stockpile. This is in some ways symbolic, but again, what do the Russian leaders gain?
Well, as I said, they do have strategic interests in Syria, and that should not be discounted. They feel like if they can avoid an American strike in Syria, it will prevent the conflict, the momentum in the conflict from tipping towards the opposition. But there's also a nuts and bolts concern for the Russians. They aren't particularly thrilled about the prospect of Syrian chemical weapons potentially getting out of control. As they've noted, and as the American sides have noted as well, there are al-Qaeda-backed groups operating inside Syria. All it takes is for one of those facilities, which are under Syrian military guard, to fall, and those very dangerous chemicals could be in the wrong hands. The Russians are very concerned about that. They have a number of people from the Caucasus region, that's Chechnya and other areas, that have been fighting an Islamist insurgency against the Russian government for decades. And they're very worried about some of those Chechen fighters that are in Syria coming back with things like chemical weapons and bringing the fight there.
It's interesting as well, Kirit, we've gone from a situation where both Russia and Syria completely and unequivocally denied that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons, that they even had chemical weapons, to both saying, okay, we know they do, and we're ready to make a deal here. Yeah, and that's a very good point, and I think it points to the fact that both the Syrians and the Russians were very worried about an American strike. You know, last week a American official told my colleague, ABC News colleague John Carl, that their plans for a strike, a Western strike on Syria, while limited, would have done more damage in 48 hours, than the Syrian rebels had done in 2.5 years of civil war. So even if this was, from the U.S. perspective, a limited strike, it would have posed a significant challenge to the Syrian military, and could have potentially tipped the scales in the favor of the rebels. That's something that the Syrian government, of course, didn't want to do, and they see this as a way of, at the very least, delaying a strike. Experts have said that in order to actually carry out this removal of the chemical weapons, it could take years, and it would be very difficult to do in the middle of a war zone. So, at the very worst, from their perspective, this is a delaying tactic, if not saving their own skin. All right, Kirit Radia, thank you so much for joining us, reporting from Moscow via Skype. And now, I'd like to turn to ABC's Jeff Zeleny in Washington for more. Jeff, the president saying he just needs the threat of military intervention to keep this diplomatic process going. What are people making of that, and what are the odds that we will now see a vote in Congress?
Well, we're certainly not going to see a vote in Congress anytime this week, possibly anytime soon. That was one of the messages that the president took directly to senators yesterday, meeting in a closed-door session separately with Republicans and Democrats. And basically he said his message was, don't undercut my authority, translating that into, don't have a vote here, don't let this fail, that will weaken the U.S. Position abroad. But I was struck by the conversations I had with several Republican senators who have been skeptical of this, that they do seem to be willing to give the president some time for diplomacy, perhaps to a work or not. But the question is, what is the fallback plan? If this does not work, if Russia and Syria and the United Nations, if this world community is not able to reach some type of a deal on this, reach some type of a way forward for removing the chemical weapons. What's the fallback plan? So yes, military strikes are still squarely on the table, but the president doesn't quite have the support in Congress for those. So right now, a holding pattern. There was initially supposed to be a vote today in the Senate, the first vote on this. The president asked for a delay, and that's what he's getting. No one is eager to vote on this in Congress. No one is pushing this. Everyone is sort of breathing a sigh of relief.
Now, you mentioned that obviously military intervention is still very much on the table. Here's what the president had to say about that.
To my friends on the right, I ask you to reconcile your commitment to America's military might with a failure to act when a cause is so plainly just. To my friends on the left, I ask you to reconcile your belief in freedom and dignity for all people with those images of children writhing in pain and going still on a cold hospital floor. For sometimes resolutions and statements of condemnation are simply not enough. Indeed, I'd ask every member of Congress and those of you watching at home tonight to view those videos of the attack and then ask, what kind of world will we live in if the United States of America sees a dictator brazenly violate international law with poison gas and we choose to look the other way?
So there you have the president talking to congressional members on the left and on the right, but also to the American public. Where do we know or believe that the American public stands on this issue right now?
Well, we know that the American public is squarely against any type of military action, certainly any type of unilateral military action. And the American public also seems convinced that chemical weapons were used. So basically they're saying that, it's not our problem, or why is it our problem? And the president was pretty blunt in acknowledging this yesterday in his closed-door meetings on Capitol Hill. He said that he knows that he will not be able to turn around the tide of public opinion, particularly just in one speech. But he said it is incumbent upon all and the president certainly and other congressional leaders to lead public opinion, not just following it. So it's very unlikely that many minds were changed by the president's speech last night or this new round of diplomacy, but he certainly bought himself some time, and that is certainly important as well.
And you mentioned members of Congress are relieved to also have some time as well, but is there a general consensus among people you've spoken to that they trust the Russians to broker this deal?
No, there is no sense of trust. They know that they need to trust but verify. The old saying from President Reagan, and President Obama invoked that several times in his meetings yesterday, but they are deeply skeptical of the actions and the intent of the Syrians and Russians here. So trust but verify is sort of the central theme going forward here. But no one is eager to see this vote in Congress fail. So they are very fine with giving it a little bit more time for diplomacy. But there are some alternative resolutions, some fallback plans just beginning to shape up. But they're hoping that they don't have to use those or vote on this certainly this week, and it may take several weeks.
All right, ABC's Jeff Delaney in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you joining us at home, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York, and you've been watching an ABC News Digital Special Report.
This has been a special report from ABC News Digital.